Hello. My name's the one my father never wanted spoken with pride. He said I wasn't military material, that I'd shame the family if I ever wore a uniform. But here I am, standing in boots he swore I'd never fill. The letter he wrote still burns in my mind, the words meant to break me, and now, he's walked onto my base, into my world, ready to tear me down in front of everyone. Will I crumble, or will this be the moment I finally rise? I set the table the way my mother used to when she still believed a good meal could soften hard people. White plates, folded cloth napkins, a cinnamon candle to make the old house feel kinder than it is. Outside, late autumn light faded behind the maple. Inside, the oven hummed and the radio mumbled a ball game. In my pocket, I kept a small note card with good news, the kind you want to say out loud without sounding proud. My father arrived exactly on time, the way he always did, as if lateness were a moral failure. He shook rain from his jacket and came in without waiting to be welcomed. He nodded at me the way men nod at someone they might meet again but don't plan to know. My aunt and two cousins followed with salad and pie, laughter trailing them into the living room where pictures of my brother's kids lined the mantel. We sat. I poured iced tea. Talk stayed safe. Traffic on the interstate, the neighbor's new dog, how early the leaves fell this year. I ladled stew, felt the edge of the card in my pocket like a smooth stone. When a pause opened, I cleared my throat and said I'd had a good week, that a selection panel had reviewed my file and moved me forward. My aunt's smile reached her eyes. My cousins clinked their spoons as if to cheer. My father set his spoon down in a careful line with his knife and said without looking up, "Forward to what?" It was not a question. It was a sentence shaped like one. I added a few words about the process. He lifted his eyes then, pale and steady. "They'll take anyone these days if the paperwork is tidy," he said. The room didn't go silent. It got smaller. My aunt reached for the salt, though the stew didn't need it. A cousin asked me about yesterday's weather, the way families build quick shelter around a remark that shouldn't be said. I told myself to breathe, slow in, slower out. I cut a piece of bread and listened to the crust crackle. My father watched as if measuring the distance between my hands and the table. "You were always good at school," he added. "That's different from being good at what matters." "What matters?" my aunt asked lightly, already knowing. He didn't answer. He took another bite, proving a point without words. The candle guttered and righted itself. The ball game murmured from the other room. Inside, a smaller version of me stepped back into a younger kitchen where report cards lived on the fridge for a day and then disappeared. I remembered the first mile I ran under 8 minutes and how he said, "Try for 7." I remembered carrying in groceries alone while he worked a wrench in the garage and told me I held the bags wrong. I refilled glasses and asked my cousins about their jobs. I kept moving the conversation the way you move furniture to hide a stain in the carpet. But the stain was there, and he had laid it down with 4 words and a tone his father likely used on him before mine ever learned to speak. After dinner, I brought coffee and pie. My father took his black, holding the cup like a tool. "I suppose the next step is more tests," he said. "Paper, interviews, people with clipboards." "Yes," I said. "Those folks love checklists. You can't measure grit on a checklist." My aunt made a soft sound that could be agreement or discomfort. The hall clock ticked, patient as breath. I set my cup down. "I know what grit is," I said. "You taught me to finish what I start." For a second, something not hard moved across his face. Then it was gone. "Finishing and belonging aren't the same," he said. "Some people finish because others carry them." "I'm not being carried," I said, and heard the thinness in my voice. He shrugged, a small gesture that meant the conversation had already ended for him. We cleared the table. The game ended. My cousins hugged me longer than usual. My aunt squeezed my hand and promised to call. My father waited by the coat rack, hat in hand. He tapped the brim against his palm. "Be smart," he said. "Don't get ideas bigger than your frame can handle." He set the hat on and stepped into the mist like a man walking back into an old photograph. I washed dishes because that is what you do when you are trying not to replay a sentence. Steam fogged the window. The maple stood like a dark sentry. In my pocket, The note card had softened at the corners. Later, with the candle blown out, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote down what he said and how he said it, not for proof, for pattern. On the last line, I wrote the words I hadn't said aloud. His voice tonight carried certainty, not doubt. Certainty that I was not the kind of person he trusted with difficult things. The words looked stark on the page, like tracks in new snow. I traced them with a fingertip and felt my pulse steady, not weaker, but clearer, as if my body had decided to stop bracing and start listening. At the stairs, I told myself a sentence at a dinner table could not undo a decade of work. People change or they don't, and it isn't my job to teach them. But something had shifted in a way I could not reverse. I had always treated remarks like his as weather to be waited out. Tonight they felt like a forecast I could read. For the first time, I felt the sting of his words settling into my bones, whispering that a storm was coming. The rain hadn't stopped. It tapped against my window in a rhythm too steady to ignore, like a metronome marking the beats of my sleepless night. I lay on my back, eyes open, staring at the faint light that bled through the curtains. No matter how many times I shifted, no matter how tightly I pulled the blanket around me, I couldn't push away his words. Not military material. The phrase replayed in my mind as though my father had whispered it into the dark, standing right there beside my bed. My chest tightened every time I heard it. Maybe it was because the words weren't new. They never really were. His voice had been the soundtrack of my life, an endless reminder that I was less than what I dreamed to be. I turned on my side, curling my knees to my chest, the way I used to when I was little. My mother's muffled voice echoed from the kitchen earlier that evening, trying to soften the blow, but she hadn't said a word at the table, just silence. That silence stung almost as much as his words. And then, without warning, a memory stirred. A face, a crowd, the smell of cheap perfume and the faint tang of floor polish. The moment came rushing back with such force that I squeezed my eyes shut. It was graduation day. The gymnasium buzzed with restless excitement, the kind that only happens when hundreds of teenagers believe their lives are just about to begin. Blue gowns swayed, tassels bobbed, parents waved from the bleachers, snapping blurry photos on outdated cameras. I had been one of those hopeful graduates, my cap slipping slightly to the side, my palms damp as I clutched the edge of my diploma cover. I remember scanning the crowd, heart racing, desperate to catch my father's eyes. I thought maybe, just maybe, he would look at me with pride, and for a fleeting second, I believed he did. But then he leaned toward an uncle seated beside him, his voice cutting sharp even over the applause. "She's book smart, sure, but the real world, she won't last. Too soft. Too naive." I froze mid-step on the stage, diploma in hand, as if the words had stripped the breath from my lungs. My classmates cheered, the principal shook my hand, and somewhere in the distance, a camera flashed. But inside, something cracked. I didn't cry. Not then. I smiled, posed for the picture, waved to my friends. But my chest burned with shame I couldn't name, as though I had been exposed, like he had told the entire world what I feared deep down was true. And then, there was her, my mother, sitting just a seat away from him. She glanced at me, her face calm, unreadable. For a heartbeat, I thought she would defend me, tell him to hush, remind him that this was my day. But she didn't. She looked down at her lap, fingers entwined, and said nothing. That silence wrapped around me tighter than any insult could. Back in the present, I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling my heart beat unevenly. That memory had been buried so deep I hadn't let myself think about it for years. But tonight, my father's remark at the dinner table had torn it wide open. Why hadn't she said anything? My mother had always been the softer one, the one who slipped me cookies when he wasn't looking, the one who kissed my forehead when he thought affection was weakness. So why, at that moment, did she choose silence? It didn't feel like fear. It didn't even feel like resignation. It felt deliberate, like she was protecting something or hiding something. The realization sat heavy in my stomach, spreading unease through my veins. All these years, I had blamed him for my smallness, for the words that clipped my wings before I ever tried to fly. But what if it wasn't just him? What if her silence was another bar in the cage I hadn't realized I lived inside? The thought chilled me. I turned back toward the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, blurring the world outside. For the first time, I wasn't sure who I could trust in my own family. And in that moment, a question I had never dared to ask finally surfaced, clear as the storm outside. What if my mother's silence wasn't weakness at all, but complicity? The morning after the dinner felt strangely hollow, like the house itself was holding its breath. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, striping the kitchen table with uneven bands of gold. I wrapped my hands around a mug of coffee, letting the steam fog my glasses for a moment before I wiped them clean. I wanted the ordinary comfort of a routine, coffee, toast, maybe scrolling through my phone, anything to erase the echo of my father's words from the night before. But when the mail slid through the slot in the front door, the rhythm of the day shifted. Bills, advertisements, the usual clutter, and then one envelope stood out. Its paper was heavier, its print crisp, the emblem in the corner unmistakable. The U.S. Army. My heart kicked against my ribs as if it already knew something my mind couldn't grasp. I carried it to the table like it might burn me if I moved too quickly. The envelope trembled in my hands, and not from the draft drifting through the kitchen window. I told myself to breathe, to act normal, but the longer I stared at that seal, the more impossible it became. For years, my father's voice had been the loudest in my head. You're not cut out for anything like that. You'd never survive. You're not military material. He had said it so often it had become a refrain, a truth I swallowed even when it tasted like poison. And now, sitting in front of me, was a letter that might prove him wrong, or prove him right in ways I feared most. I slit the envelope open with the edge of a butter knife, careful, almost reverent. The paper inside was stiff, formal. My eyes caught the heading first. United States Army Officer Candidate School, Selection Notification. My throat went dry. It wasn't just junk mail. It wasn't a mistake. The letter spelled it out in black and white. I had been recommended and accepted into the preliminary track for leadership training, a program that funneled civilians into officer roles if they proved capable. Capable. The very word my father had always dangled out of reach. I reread the lines again, afraid they might vanish if I blinked too hard. The more I traced the sentences, the more surreal they felt. My name, my address, the date, all real. But the reason, that stopped me cold. At the bottom of the page, in neat block letters, was the source of the recommendation, Mr. Carter, Senior JROTC Instructor, Lincoln High School. For a second the kitchen blurred, my vision swimming. I hadn't thought of Mr. Carter in years. A retired Army captain who had taught leadership courses and discipline when most of us were just restless teenagers counting the hours until graduation. I remembered him standing at the edge of the stage the night my father's sharp laughter cut through my moment of triumph. While my father mocked me for dreaming too big, Mr. Carter had been there, his jaw tight, his eyes steady. Afterward, he'd pulled me aside, told me I had resilience most people overlooked. I hadn't believed him then, but somehow, across the years, he had believed in me enough to write my name into this future. The letter trembled in my grip. Pride flared, bright and dangerous, followed instantly by fear. What if my father was right? What if stepping into this path only proved how weak I truly was? What if the Army chewed me up and spat me out, and I ended up crawling back home to the same table, the same dismissive stare? I pressed the paper flat against the table, smoothing the creases with my palm, as if I could iron out my doubts the same way. My mother moved quietly in the background, rinsing dishes at the sink, saying nothing. For a moment I wanted her to look at me, to see what I held, to break her silence. But she didn't. The clink of porcelain was the only sound she made, and I realized she might never be the voice that pushed me forward. It had to be mine. I whispered the words aloud, just to test their weight. Officer Candidate School. The syllables were strange, heavy, but not impossible. The kitchen clock ticked, steady and unforgiving. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, its noise fading down the street. The world was still moving, ordinary, while inside me something extraordinary cracked open. I folded the letter slowly, my fingers stiff with adrenaline, and slid it back into its envelope. It felt less like paper now and more like a dare, one I wasn't sure I had the courage to accept. My father's voice tried to rise again, tried to tell me I would fail. But beneath it, quieter yet steadier, was Mr. Carter's. You have resilience most people overlook. For the first time, I thought about what it would mean to trust that second voice, to step into a life my father had sworn I could never handle, to become someone he would never expect me to be. I set the envelope in front of me, pressing my palms flat on either side of it, like bracing myself against the tide. If I said yes, I whispered into the quiet kitchen, I'd be stepping into a life my father swore I could never handle. Was I ready to prove him wrong, or to lose myself trying? The words hung there, fragile but alive, and in that stillness I knew this wasn't just an invitation. It was a dare. The morning light crept through the thin curtains, spilling across the kitchen table where I sat with my hands curled around a chipped mug of coffee. The warmth did little to chase away the chill that clung to me, the kind of cold that had less to do with temperature and more with memory. My father's voice echoed in my head, sharp and dismissive as ever. You're not military material. You don't have what it takes. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to ground myself in the ordinary. I spooned sugar into the mug, stirred, then tapped the spoon twice against the rim like I always did. The ritual felt safe. Normal. After everything that had happened last night, the storm of doubt, the restless dreams, normal was all I wanted. That's when I heard the soft slap of mail landing on the floor. At first I didn't move. Most mornings the mail was nothing but bills and junk, but something tugged at me. I set the mug down, walked to the door, and there it was, a small pile, topped by one envelope that looked utterly out of place. The paper was heavier, cream-colored, and stamped with a seal I didn't immediately recognize. My name was written in a blocky official typeface, not the messy cursive of a neighbor or the looping advertisements that promised discounts I'd never use. I froze. My pulse ticked faster. Back at the table, I turned the envelope over and over in my hands. The corners were sharp, the flap sealed tight. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe another credit card pre-approval dressed up to look important. But the seal belonged to the Department of Defense. For a moment, the world blurred around me. With fingers that didn't feel like my own, I tore it open. The letter unfolded slowly, each crease releasing a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Dear Ms. It began, the words crisp and deliberate. We are pleased to inform you that you have been selected for consideration in the Military Leadership Development Program. I read the line 3 times, the words refusing to settle. Selected. Leadership. My throat tightened as though the very air resisted passage. Further down, the letter explained. The program was highly competitive, reserved for candidates with resilience, adaptability, and untapped leadership potential. Me. I thought of my father's words again. The way he had looked at me like I was already a failure before I'd even begun. And yet here it was, in black and white. But the line that stopped me cold was near the bottom. Your candidacy has been recommended by Mr. Thomas Carter, retired faculty, Westfield High School. Mr. Carter. It took me a second to place the name. Then it hit like a sudden flash of lightning. High school graduation. The day my father had made his cutting remarks in front of everyone. I remembered standing there, diploma in hand, face hot with shame as his voice carried across the crowd. Don't get any ideas, college, the military, none of it. You won't make it. And then, afterward, Mr. Carter had pulled me aside. His voice had been quiet, firm. You don't have to believe him. You're stronger than he wants you to think. I had buried that moment deep, convinced it was just a kindness, something polite teachers said when they saw a student humiliated. But he had remembered. And not just remembered, he had acted. Years later, he had written my name down, vouched for me, believed in me when no one else had. My hands trembled as I lowered the paper. Pride and fear crashed into each other inside me, an emotional storm I couldn't name. Part of me wanted to shout, to hold the letter high and prove to the world that I wasn't the failure my father claimed I was. Another part of me wanted to crumple it, to shove it away before it could confirm his prophecy, that I would collapse under pressure, humiliate myself again, prove him right. The kitchen around me felt unreal, like a stage set suddenly stripped bare. The ticking clock on the wall, the half-empty coffee cup, the hum of the refrigerator, all background noise to the roar inside my chest. I pressed the letter flat against the table, smoothing out the creases, as though order on the page could give me order in my heart. But nothing stilled the question rising in me, loud and relentless. Could I do this? I remembered the look in Mr. Carter's eyes that day years ago. He hadn't pitied me. He had seen me. And now, across the span of time, he was still seeing me. Tears pricked at my eyes, hot and unwelcome. I blinked hard, forcing them back. This wasn't just a letter. It was a challenge. A test. If I said yes, I would be stepping into a life my father swore I could never handle. I would be crossing into a world where failure wasn't just personal. It could mean letting down everyone who placed their trust in me. I folded the letter slowly, carefully, as though it might burn me if I moved too fast. My fingers shook as I pressed the crease flat. The bus shuddered to a stop, brakes hissing in the heat. My forehead rested against the window, and when I finally opened my eyes, the world outside had changed. Gone were the familiar sidewalks and muted comfort of home. Before us stretched a barren training ground, flat earth, blinding sunlight, and rows of low, squat buildings that looked more like obstacles than shelter. A whistle shrieked from somewhere unseen, sharp enough to slice through bone. My heart jolted. We filed off in silence, boots crunching against gravel. The air was dry and unforgiving, smelling faintly of dust and sweat even before the drills began. Ahead, lines of beds were visible through open barracks doors. Identical, stripped of personality, as if reminding us we had entered a place where individuality had no currency. Comfort had been traded for order. I tried to stand tall, though my stomach knotted. My father's words, the ones he had thrown at me for years, echoed with cruel precision. "You'll never make it. You're too soft." That voice seemed to linger in the hot wind. I swallowed hard and kept walking. The first whistle blast came like a gunshot. "Line up, now!" His voice was thunder, carrying across the open yard before I even saw him. The drill sergeant strode into view. A broad, rigid figure with a jaw set in stone and eyes that seemed to size us up like defective machinery. We scrambled into a crooked line. My pulse raced, hands damp, breath shallow. "Pathetic," he barked, walking the line. "You call this straight? You think the world waits for your comfort? Wrong. The world breaks you first." Every word hit like a hammer. We began our first drill, push-ups, sit-ups, running laps in the sun until our lungs felt like torn paper. Recruits stumbled, boots slipped in the dirt, shouts echoed, insults sharper than the heat. Then came my turn. My arms gave out halfway through a push-up, elbows trembling as sweat dripped into the dust. "You!" The sergeant's shadow loomed. His voice crashed down on me. "If that's all you've got, you should have stayed home. You're nothing but dead weight, just like the ones who quit before the fight even starts." The words burned, not because they were new, but because I had heard them before, almost word for word, from my father. My chest clenched as though he were here, standing behind the sergeant, sneering. For a second, I faltered. The earth beneath me blurred with tears I refused to let fall. The urge to collapse was almost stronger than the will to continue. Maybe he was right. Maybe I didn't belong. But then something inside snapped, not in defeat but in defiance. His voice, my father's shadow, the weight of all those years, they became fuel. My arms shook, but I forced them to lock straight. One push-up, another. Breath ragged, body screaming, but I rose again and again until the whistle finally cut the air. "Fall in!" the sergeant shouted. My chest heaved, but I stayed on my feet. I had not broken. Later, after drills ended and we were herded toward water stations, I slumped against a post, throat raw, vision dim from exhaustion. My body begged to quit, but quitting was no longer an option. Not here, not after today. A figure approached, a fellow recruit, taller than me, with dirt streaked across his uniform and sweat dripping down his temple. He didn't say much, just offered his canteen with a faint nod. I hesitated, then took it, the water sharp and cold against my cracked lips. "Thanks," I muttered, voice barely audible. "Rough first day," he said simply, before moving back to his place in the crowd. No name exchanged, no promises, just a gesture. But it was enough. Enough to remind me that maybe, even in this harsh place, I wasn't entirely alone. That night, the barracks swallowed us whole. Rows of bunks lined the walls, each mattress as stiff as the stone floor. The lights flickered out with military precision, plunging us into silence broken only by the rustle of bodies too sore to sleep. I lay awake, every muscle screaming, my hands still trembling from the day. The drill sergeant's words echoed, but so did my own heartbeat. A steady drum, proof that I had endured. If I can survive today, I told myself, I can survive tomorrow. Exhaustion pressed down, but one realization kept me awake, sharp and unyielding. I wasn't here just to prove my father wrong. I was here to prove myself right. The sun was already high when we lined up at the edge of the endurance field. Heat shimmered above the asphalt road, bending the horizon into a cruel mirage. I could feel sweat pooling under my collar before we had even started. The sergeant's whistle shrieked, and with it, the day began its assault. We ran first. Long laps around the dusty perimeter, boots pounding in rhythm, lungs dragging for air. The dust clung to our throats like sandpaper. My legs begged me to slow down, but slowing meant falling behind, and falling behind meant death by humiliation. The sergeant's voice sliced through the air like a blade. "Pick it up, recruits! You call that running? My grandma moves faster in church." Every insult landed like a hammer. The cadence was merciless, each lap a battle against my body and my mind. Around me, recruits gasped and stumbled, but none dared to stop. My chest burned, my vision narrowed, yet I pushed because stopping meant surrender. And I had already surrendered once in my life. At home, to my father's voice. We weren't given water, only the promise of more pain. Push-ups in the dirt followed the run. Our arms shook, faces pressed into soil and sweat. The sergeant paced above us like a predator, boots stopping behind me. "You look like you're about to cry," he barked. "What are you even doing here? Your daddy was right, you're not military material." The words sliced deeper than any blade. For a moment, I wasn't on the training field. I was back home at the kitchen table, hearing my father say it with that same dismissive smirk. Heat surged behind my eyes, but I forced it down, teeth grinding as I pushed my body lower, then back up again. By midday, we reached the obstacle course. Crawling under barbed wire through thick mud, dragging ourselves belly first like worms. The mud stank of sweat and metal, sucking at my arms as if trying to bury me alive. My knees scraped raw, my uniform already ruined. A recruit ahead of me kicked dirt in my face as he scrambled forward. I coughed, gagged, and kept moving. Halfway through, I slipped. My hand lost grip, and my face slammed into the muck. Laughter erupted behind me. "Pathetic," one recruit sneered. "She won't last the week," another muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. The sergeant didn't silence them. Instead, he added fuel. "Maybe they're right," he shouted for all to hear. "Maybe you're here to prove your daddy right." The shame burned hotter than the sun overhead. Every cell in my body screamed to quit. I clawed forward through the mud anyway, tears mixing with sweat and filth. My breath was ragged, my muscles shaking uncontrollably, and then the world tilted. The sunlight dimmed, voices grew muffled, and suddenly I was on my back, staring at the hazy sky. My chest heaved, but no air seemed to fill it. A medic's face hovered above me, voice distant, clinical. "She's fainted," he said flatly. "Might be done." Around me, recruits whispered, "Knew it." "She's finished." Should have stayed home. The words echoed with my father's. You'll never make it. You'll break the first time life tests you. Maybe he was right. I wanted to close my eyes, sink into that blackness, and never wake. But then, another voice tore through the fog. On your feet, the sergeant loomed above me, eyes burning. Show me you're not as weak as they think, or prove them right, your choice. He didn't offer sympathy. He didn't dismiss me. He challenged me. Something inside me snapped, not in defeat, but in defiance. My arms shook as I pushed against the dirt. My knees buckled, but I dragged them under me. Every inch was agony, but each inch was mine. I crawled back under the wire, dragging my battered body forward. The sergeant didn't cheer, but he didn't stop me either. By the time the whistle finally blew, I was coated head to toe in mud, chest burning, throat raw. But I was still on the field, still standing. The recruits who mocked me said nothing as I staggered past them. One familiar face, my silent ally from yesterday, offered me a canteen, his nod small but real. I drank greedily, water spilling down my chin, and for the first time that day, I felt the faintest flicker of pride. Night fell heavy over the barracks. My body screamed with pain, my arms too sore to lift the thin blanket. But exhaustion wasn't the only thing keeping me awake. As I stared at the ceiling, whispers of doubt gnawed at me, but so did something else, something fiercer. If this is the breaking point, I whispered into the darkness, then let me break and rebuild stronger. I thought the day had broken me, but as I lay there in the silence, I realized it had done something else. It had lit a fire I didn't know I carried. The night air cut colder than I expected. Floodlights buzzed above the training grounds, throwing harsh shadows across the obstacle course. The ground was slick with mud, and the wind carried the smell of sweat, steel, and something harsher, anticipation. My body still ached from the brutal drills of the day before, but tonight wasn't about individual endurance. Tonight, it was about the team. Or at least that's what the drill sergeant barked before disappearing into the shadows to let the course itself do the shouting. We were handed heavy packs, loaded down with sandbags and gear, the kind of weight that pressed instantly on your shoulders like the hand of judgment. Each of us was responsible for carrying not just our own load, but the success of the person next to us. If one failed, we all failed. The punishment would be shared. I felt the sideways glances. Nobody said it outright, but I knew the thought burning in their minds. She'll be the one to break us. I was the liability, the weak link. I tightened the straps of my pack, willing myself not to tremble. The whistle blew. We charged forward, boots slapping mud, packs digging into our backs. The first obstacle was a crawl under low-hanging wire, barbs glittering under the lights. Mud soaked into my uniform as I dragged myself forward, elbows and knees grinding into the wet earth. Around me, curses and grunts filled the air. By the time we reached the rope climb, my arms burned. The rope swayed under the weight of recruit after recruit. My palms stung, raw from gripping too tightly. Ahead of me was the rival, the one who'd laughed the loudest when I stumbled before, who sneered when the sergeant called me weak. He was halfway up when his boot slipped. His body slammed into the rope, twisting, and for a terrifying moment he dangled helplessly. He cursed, flailed, tried to pull himself up again, but his strength was gone. If he fell, it wasn't just his problem. It meant the entire unit's failure. I froze. Every part of me remembered his smirk, the way he echoed my father's words in mockery. My chest tightened. For one breath, I wanted to let him fall, to prove to him, to everyone, that mockery had consequences. But then something else rose inside me. A voice that wasn't my father's, wasn't the sergeant's. It was mine. We don't win by watching someone fall. We win by pulling them up. I climbed harder, ignoring the fire in my arms. I reached out, catching his harness. "Grab the rope," I shouted through clenched teeth. He looked at me, eyes wide with disbelief. Then, grudgingly, he obeyed. Together we steadied him, inch by inch, until he hauled himself back into position and scrambled over the top. When I pulled myself over after him, chest heaving, I felt more than mud and sweat on my skin. I felt eyes, watching, measuring. And for the first time, not all of them looked down on me. The course went on, walls, pits, endless stretches of muck, But something had shifted. The ally who'd shared water with me days ago appeared at my side, steadying my pack when it tilted, muttering, "Keep pace with me." Others, too, began to adjust their rhythm, so we moved as one instead of scattered bodies. We weren't perfect, but we were no longer a collection of loners. We were starting to resemble a team. And by the time we stumbled across the finish line, caked in grime, our packs heavier with fatigue than sand, I heard something I hadn't expected. A low ripple of acknowledgement. Nods. Not cheers, not handshakes, but subtle, silent marks of respect. Even from the rival. The sergeant said nothing, only scribbled on his clipboard, but I caught the faintest curl at the corner of his mouth, approval hidden behind stone. As we broke formation and dragged ourselves back toward the barracks, the ally leaned close and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "You've got more fight in you than you think. Don't stop now." That night I lay on my bunk, every muscle screaming in protest. Yet beneath the ache was something I hadn't felt before. Pride that wasn't born of defiance, but of belonging. For the first time, the pain didn't just mark survival. It carried the fragile weight of trust. The rain started before dawn, pounding against the tin roof of the barracks like 1,000 impatient fists. I lay on my bunk staring up at the ceiling, the echo of last night's words still clinging to me. "You've got more fight in you than you think. Don't stop now." For a moment I let myself believe it. The nods from my fellow recruits, the reluctant respect in their eyes, it had felt real. But as the storm pressed harder against the walls, doubt began creeping back in. Was it respect or pity? Did they think I had earned my place here, or had they just been surprised I hadn't quit? The rain didn't care about my questions. It hammered on, relentless, until the bugle split the air. We were ordered out into the storm. The field was already a swamp, puddles rising into rivulets, mud sucking at our boots with each step. The drill sergeant stood at the edge of the track, water dripping from the brim of his cap, his voice cut through the rain like a whip. "Endurance drill. No excuses, no exceptions, move." We staggered into motion, packs strapped to our backs, rifles slick with rain. The storm turned every obstacle into a trap. The ropes became serpents twisting in the wind, the walls slick like glass, the mud an endless pit. I forced my body forward, muscles burning with every climb, every crawl. The storm outside wasn't the only one raging. Inside me, a war of voices battled. One screamed that I didn't belong here, that my father had been right all along. Another whispered that I had survived this long for a reason. My chest tightened, my breaths turned ragged. Each drop of rain on my face felt like a hammer blow, and then my legs gave way. I hit the mud face first, the taste of earth and grit filling my mouth. The world narrowed to a tunnel, rain, mud, breath. Around me, boots splashed past. Nobody stopped. Why would they? Weak links broke. Weak links were left behind. I clawed at the ground, trying to push myself up. My arms shook violently, refusing. The drill sergeant's voice thundered above me. "Crawl or quit! Show me you've got something in you, or stay down in the dirt where you belong." I didn't have the strength to stand, but something raw and primal surged up inside me. If I couldn't walk, I would crawl. So I did. Elbows digging into mud, knees dragging, my body moving inch by inch forward. The storm blurred around me, but I kept crawling. That's when I felt a hand. It wasn't the allies. It wasn't kindness. It was the rival, the same recruit who had mocked me from day one, the one I had pulled up on the ropes just nights ago. He gripped my arm hard, his jaw set in irritation more than compassion. "Don't make us all pay because you're stubborn," he muttered, yanking me to my feet. It wasn't friendship, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. And in that moment, it was enough. Together we stumbled forward, the storm soaking us to the bone, the drill sergeant's whistle slicing through the chaos. Step by step, we pushed through the obstacle course, a ragged rhythm of willpower and necessity. When it was finally over, we collapsed in the mud, gasping for air. The sergeant walked past, eyes lingering on me, just long enough for me to catch the faintest flicker of acknowledgement. No words, no praise. Just a look that said I hadn't broken. Back in the barracks, I sat on the edge of my bunk, peeling off mud-caked boots. My hands trembled, my body screamed with exhaustion, but my heart was strangely quiet. The storm still howled outside, but inside I felt something shift. I wasn't afraid of being swallowed by it anymore, because I had already survived the one inside me. The medical tent smelled faintly of iodine and damp canvas, a reminder that even the storm from yesterday hadn't left us completely. I sat on the narrow cot, my muscles aching from head to toe, my knees still caked with a stubborn crust of mud. Every inhale felt sharp, like glass against my ribs, but I forced myself to sit upright when the medic entered. "You're lucky," she muttered, pressing her stethoscope against my chest. "No broken bones, just bruising." Lucky, that word tasted bitter. I remembered the way the rain had beaten against my face, the way my body had finally collapsed into the mud while others kept moving. But I hadn't stopped. I crawled, clawing through the storm as if my life depended on it. Maybe it had. When the medic left me alone, silence returned. And silence was more dangerous than pain. In silence, my father's voice returned, louder than the pounding rain had been. "You'll never make it. You're fragile, not military material." I clenched my fists in the stiff sheets. Yesterday, I had proved him wrong. Hadn't I? Or had the others just seen me as pathetic, a stubborn fool too reckless to quit? The thought festered in me as the clouds outside shifted, shadows stretching longer across the tent walls. I left the cot slowly, every step an ache, and walked toward the yard where the rest of the recruits were assembling. The ground was still soft, swallowing my boots with every step. The training yard looked like a battlefield already lost, puddles the size of craters, mud churned by too many feet. The storm had passed, but its ghost lingered in the thick, heavy air. The drill sergeant stood before us, hands clasped behind his back. His eyes scanned the line like searchlights. Yesterday's storm hadn't softened him. If anything, he seemed harder, carved from the same stone as the barracks walls. "Uniform inspection," he barked. A collective groan rose but died quickly. He shot us a glare sharp enough to slice it apart. "You think the enemy cares if you're tired? You think they'll wait until you're rested, stripped to undershirts, now?" My breath caught. A wave of unease surged through me as I glanced down the line. Recruits shrugged off jackets, pulled at damp fabric, muttering under their breath. My fingers refused to move at first. Undershirt, thin cotton, no armor to hide behind. The scars. My chest tightened as I unbuttoned my uniform jacket. Each snap of the button felt like a gunshot in the quiet yard. I pulled it off slowly, as though delaying the inevitable might somehow save me. The cool air struck my skin, and I heard it. The sudden drop in conversation, the hush that fell when my undershirt revealed what I'd hidden since day one. Jagged lines across my ribcage, a long, puckered scar stretching from shoulder to sternum, a patchwork of history I never wanted to explain. For a moment, no one breathed. Then the whispers started. "Jesus. What happened to her? She's broken. How is she even here?" Heat flooded my face, hotter than the fever of yesterday's storm. I wanted to vanish, to dissolve into the mud beneath me. The drill sergeant said nothing. His eyes flickered over me, unreadable, before moving on. But the damage was done. I could hear them behind me like snakes hissing in grass. Every word was a lash against my skin. "She's not fit. They'll wash her out." How could she fight like that? I closed my eyes, and my father's voice bled into theirs, cruel and exact. "You'll never stand tall again. Not after what happened." I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But before I could move, another voice cut through the noise. Strong, sharp, unexpected. "Shut it." The yard went still. Heads turned. It was him, the rival recruit who had spent weeks needling me, mocking every mistake, throwing my failures back at me. His face was tight, jaw clenched, but his voice carried across the line with authority. "She's tougher than all of us," he said. "You saw it yesterday. She didn't quit. Not once. She's proved it." Silence followed. Even the drill sergeant's gaze lingered on him for a long beat, as though weighing the truth in those words. I stared at him, stunned. My rival, my tormentor, was defending me, not kindly, not warmly, but with a blunt force that silenced every whisper. I didn't know whether to feel grateful or suspicious, maybe both. The inspection continued, but my thoughts spun faster than the sergeant's commands. I had lived years treating my scars as a prison, a mark of weakness, proof that I was permanently broken. I had covered them with long sleeves, avoided mirrors, built walls high enough to keep everyone from seeing. And yet today, when they were exposed under the gray sky for all to see, something shifted. The whispers had stung, yes, but the silence that followed my rival's words had been louder. They were looking at me differently. Not with pity, not entirely with doubt. Some looked with recognition, some with respect. The drill sergeant ended the inspection with a curt nod. Fall back in, dismissed. As the line broke, I stood still, staring at the muddy ground, heart hammering. My rival passed me without a word, his shoulder brushing mine in the narrow gap. He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. That night, lying on my bunk, I traced the scars with my fingertips. For years they had been chains, dragging me back to the moment of pain, to my father's judgment, to the whispers of not good enough. But today, under the cloudy sky, those same scars had silenced a yard full of recruits. For the first time, I realized they were not just wounds, they were proof. Proof I had fallen and risen, proof I had broken and kept going. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't weakness at all. I turned onto my side, closing my eyes against the dim light. The yard had gone quiet, but inside me, something roared louder than the storm. The barracks had never felt this still. Usually by nightfall there was at least some hum of chatter. Boots unlaced, low laughter, the scrape of metal footlockers opening and closing as we prepared for the next day's punishment. But when I pushed open the creaking door after chow, the air pressed in quiet, like the storm had sucked the sound from every wall and beam. The bulb overhead flickered with a dull yellow glow, just enough to make shadows stretch long across the bunks. I stepped carefully, feeling the ache in my legs from yesterday's storm drill. Every muscle screamed, but that wasn't what froze me in place. On my pillow lay an envelope. The paper was thick, off-white, smudged at one corner as if handled by too many hands. My stomach tightened before my mind even caught up. The handwriting across the front, sharp, deliberate strokes of a fountain pen, was unmistakable. My father. For a moment, all the sounds I'd been missing rushed back, his voice booming from a childhood kitchen, the scrape of his chair as he rose to correct me, the sting of his words that had always seemed sharper than any blade. I didn't move. I just stared. My bunkmate, a quiet girl from Nebraska, glanced up from her cot. She must have noticed me stiffen because her eyes flicked from me to the envelope, then back. She didn't say anything, only nodded once as if to say, "It's yours, deal with it." Then she rolled over, leaving me alone with the ghost of his handwriting. I sat down slowly, the springs beneath me groaning. My heart thudded in my chest, faster than it had even during yesterday's mud crawl. My fingers hovered above the paper. Part of me wanted to slip it beneath the pillow and pretend it hadn't come. Another part, the smaller, more foolish part, wondered if maybe, just maybe, he'd written something different this time. Maybe he'd seen the storm report, maybe he'd heard I hadn't quit, maybe pride had cracked open the wall between us. Hope is a dangerous thing. I tore the envelope open with trembling hands. The first line hit like a blow to the ribs. "You've embarrassed this family again." The words blurred, then sharpened. My eyes darted across the page, desperate for even a flicker of encouragement hidden between the lines. But every sentence was worse than the last. "I told you from the start you weren't built for this, and now the whole world sees it. Those scars you carry, proof you're broken. You don't belong in uniform. You don't belong among soldiers. You've dragged our name through the mud, just like you did when you were a child, pretending, failing, making excuses." I swallowed hard. My throat burned as if the storm's rain had flooded inside me, drowning the breath I needed. Each word seemed written in fire. He didn't stop at questioning my strength. He tore into my endurance, mocking the way I'd crawled through mud, calling it a spectacle, a pathetic show of stubbornness. Real soldiers don't crawl in the dirt like animals. Real soldiers don't flaunt their weakness and call it grit. You think they respect you? They pity you. And I will not have a daughter who mistakes pity for pride. My fingers clenched the paper so tightly the edges cut into my skin. The barracks around me faded until all I could hear was his voice, layered over the scrawl. I was 10 again, standing in the yard after falling off the rope swing, blood dripping down my arm, while he told me crying was disgraceful. I was 15, failing to lift the weight he demanded, hearing him mutter that I was no son, just a disappointment. I was 18, lying in a hospital bed after the accident, my body stitched and bandaged, while he paced at the end of the room muttering, "See, proof." Weakness follows you everywhere. And now I was here, on this cot, letters shaking in my hands, the years folding into one moment. Shame swelled like a storm surge. I wanted to hide, to crumple the letter and shove it under the mattress before anyone saw the tears pricking my eyes. My chest felt tight, as though invisible hands pressed me down. But then, a shift. Something sparked inside, small but bright. It was anger, yes, but also something steadier, defiance. I read his sentences again, slower this time. You don't belong in uniform. The words no longer landed like shackles. They sounded hollow, brittle, like old wood about to splinter. Because hadn't I already proved him wrong? The storm drill replayed in my mind. Mud swallowing me, lungs burning, body trembling on the edge of collapse. And yet I hadn't quit. I had crawled. I had pushed. I had refused to stop even when the sergeant's voice blurred with thunder. I whispered into the dim air, the words catching before they steadied. This is not the voice of truth. This is the voice of fear. His fear, not mine. For years, I'd believed his anger was strength. Tonight, I saw it for what it was. Terror that his daughter could stand on her own, terror that I could be more than the box he'd stuffed me into. My bunkmate shifted, maybe hearing me mutter, but she stayed silent. I folded the letter carefully, not to preserve his words, but to contain them. I slid it beneath my pillow, not because I wanted it close, but because I needed it hidden. Tomorrow would bring another round of drills, another chance to prove, to myself, not to him, that I belonged here. Still, dread coiled in my stomach. If he could send this, what else could he do? Letters were only the beginning. I knew my father. He didn't let go. The rain outside had dwindled to a faint tapping against the tin roof, but it wasn't soothing. It was a clock, ticking down. I lay back, staring at the ceiling, the bulb above me flickering once before steadying. My body trembled not from exhaustion, but from the weight of choice. His words cut deep, yes, they always had, but for the first time I realized they couldn't break me, and yet, as my eyes drifted shut, one thought refused to leave me. What might he do next? The morning broke harsh and unkind, the way sunlight sometimes feels more like a blade than warmth. The air inside the barracks was heavy with the residue of last night's rain, thick with the kind of damp that clings to your skin. I hadn't really slept. The words of my father's letter had kept me awake, looping endlessly in my head like a recording I couldn't switch off. Embarrassment, shame, weak, not military material. I rolled out of my bunk mechanically, boots hitting the floor with the same hollow thud as every other morning. My roommate cast me a glance but didn't ask. She had seen me clutching that envelope until my knuckles went white, but silence was a soldier's kindness. We dressed, filed out into the yard, and fell into formation as the whistle blared. The drill sergeant barked commands, and bodies moved in perfect rhythm. Mine followed out of habit, but my mind was elsewhere, tangled in old wounds and fresh ones alike. Every shout of left and right seemed to echo my father's condemnation. My chest ached as if the words were being branded onto me with every step, and then, suddenly, the rhythm broke. A soldier ran toward the formation, urgency in his stride. He whispered something into the drill sergeant's ear. The man's brow furrowed, then his eyes scanned the line until they landed on me. "Recruit," he snapped, pointing. "You've got a visitor." A ripple of murmurs moved down the line. Visitors weren't common, and they never came during drills. My stomach lurched. I wanted to deny what my gut already knew, but my legs carried me forward anyway, each step heavier than the last. And then I saw him. My father stood just beyond the training ground fence, dressed in the kind of sharp civilian clothes that screamed authority even without a uniform. His presence seemed to slice through the rigid order of the base. The world tilted, and for a moment, I was no longer a soldier in training, but a child again, standing small under his shadow. We were led to a corner of the grounds where the commanding officer stood nearby, arms crossed, impassive. He didn't speak, only nodded, granting this meeting with a kind of silent authority. My father barely waited before launching into me, his voice booming, carrying across the training field for anyone within earshot. "I thought the letter would be enough," he began, his tone laced with disappointment sharpened into contempt. "But clearly, you still don't get it. You don't belong here. You are humiliating yourself and me." My throat tightened. The words were the same as the letters, only now they were alive, barbed with the weight of his voice. The recruits nearby pretended to stay focused on drills, but I could feel their stolen glances, the prickling heat of their curiosity. "Dad," I started, but he cut me off. "Don't call me that, not here. Do you have any idea what people think when they see you playing soldier? Do you know how pathetic you look, marching around in a uniform that you've done nothing to earn?" The commanding officer remained a silent sentinel, watching but not intervening. His neutrality felt cruel. I wished he would stop this, but part of me understood. This was my battle to fight. "You've always been weak," my father pressed on, his voice a hammer striking the same nail again and again. "You couldn't handle pressure as a child. You cried over every scraped knee, every failure. And now you think endurance scars make you some kind of hero? No. They make you a fool. A disgrace." Each word burrowed under my skin. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, the old urge to shrink, to bow, to disappear flooding back. I remembered being 10 years old, standing on the porch while he towered over me, telling me I'd never amount to anything. I remembered hiding report cards that weren't perfect, the shame of not being enough. I clenched my fists until my nails bit into my palms. The confrontation escalated with brutal speed. "Look at you," he sneered, gesturing to my posture, my uniform. "Do you think this charade fools anyone? You're a girl playing dress-up in fatigues. You will never be the kind of soldier who commands respect. You will never be what I wanted in a child, and every second you wear that uniform, you drag my name through the mud." His voice carried farther now, sharp and deliberate. I could see a few recruits falter in their drills, heads turning slightly, whispers sparking in their ranks. My humiliation was no longer private. It was public, broadcast across the grounds. Something inside me cracked. For years, I had believed his version of me, fragile, unworthy, hopeless. For years, I had let his voice dictate the story of who I was. But standing there, the sun beating down, the sweat running into my eyes, I felt a new fire rise. I met his gaze head on. "No," I said, my voice trembling but clear. "You don't get to tell me who I am, not anymore." His eyes narrowed, caught off guard. "What did you say?" I took a step forward. My whole body shook, but I didn't back down. "You don't own my story." "I do." The words hung in the air, louder than his booming accusations, louder than the whispers of the recruits. For the first time, I wasn't cowering. I wasn't the child on the porch or the teenager hiding her failures. I was here, in uniform, standing my ground. For a split second, I saw something flicker across his face. Not rage, not disdain. Something smaller, almost like fear. It vanished quickly, buried beneath the storm of his fury. "You'll regret this," he hissed, his voice low and venomous now. He stepped back, shaking his head as if to rid himself of the sight of me. "You have no idea what it means to defy me. You've made an enemy you can't afford." And with that, he turned on his heel and strode away, his presence lingering long after his body was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. The commanding officer gave no comment, only a measured nod before returning to his duties. The drills resumed, the world pretending to spin as usual. But I stood frozen, my breath ragged, my hands trembling with adrenaline. For once, I hadn't crumbled. For once, I hadn't let his words reduce me. But his parting threat clung to me like a shadow, a promise of storms yet to come. The parade ground shimmered in the noon light, heat rippling off the asphalt. Rows of soldiers stood in flawless formation, uniforms pressed, boots gleaming, rifles aligned like extensions of their bodies. The flags whipped in the sharp wind, snapping with each gust, carrying a rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. My own dress uniform clung tightly, the stiff fabric at once suffocating and empowering, each medal pinned to my chest, heavy with meaning I had fought for. Front row, almost directly across from me, sat my father. Arms crossed, face carved in stone. His eyes pinned me like a hawk watching prey. Even with all the pomp and ceremony, the roar of the crowd behind him, I felt only the weight of his stare. He looked as if he were waiting for a misstep, the faintest stumble, something to prove him right about me all along. When the band struck up the march, my steps fell in perfect time. I held my shoulders square, chin high, breath measured. The applause that rippled from the stands barely touched me. All I saw was him, his narrowed gaze, the flicker of contempt in the curl of his lip. Every step forward felt like walking against a current of doubt he had set in motion long before this day. We took our positions. The commanding officer stepped forward, voice booming across the parade ground. One by one, names were called. Recruits walked proudly to the stage, received their certificates, salutes, and polite applause. My turn drew nearer, each name before mine a countdown. My palms tingled under white gloves, not with fear this time, but with something closer to resolve. Finally, I heard my name. The world seemed to narrow, everything around me dimming except the center aisle. I marched forward, eyes ahead, the silence settling heavy over the ground as if the entire base held its breath. Out of the corner of my vision, I caught the twitch of my father's jaw. He leaned back in his seat, lips curving in what looked like a smirk, as if anticipating a collapse. I halted before the stage, saluted, and stepped up when the officer motioned me forward. The sunlight pressed down, merciless, sweat prickling my neck, but my posture did not waver. The officer handed me a small case. Inside, the Medal for Distinguished Honor Graduate, a recognition that I had not only survived training, but excelled. Whispers spread through the ranks and the crowd. My father shifted in his seat again. His eyes narrowed, no longer in smug anticipation but in confusion, even unease. For the first time, it was he who seemed uncertain. The officer stepped aside, allowing me the microphone. My breath caught. I had known this moment would come, but standing here, under the piercing gaze of hundreds, with my father sitting directly in front of me, made every muscle in my body quake. I glanced at the rows of recruits, their faces bright with sweat and pride. Then I looked at him. My voice began low, unsteady at first, but it grew stronger with each word. I wasn't supposed to be here. At least, that's what I was told. That I was too weak. That I would embarrass my family name. That my scars were proof of failure, not survival. And I believed it for a long time. Every day of this training, I carried those words like chains around my neck. The crowd hushed further. The officer didn't move to stop me. My father leaned forward now, no longer smirking but glaring. His hands tightened into fists on his knees. But here's what I've learned. Strength isn't the absence of scars. It's living with them, refusing to let them define you. Discipline isn't about blind obedience. It's about finding your own voice in the hardest moments. And respect? Respect cannot be demanded through fear. It must be earned. A murmur of agreement passed through the soldiers behind me, a subtle shift of shoulders, heads held higher. I inhaled, my chest tight but full. For years I fought for one man's approval. But today I stand here not for him, not for his name, but for every soldier beside me who refused to quit. for every heart that beats under this uniform. For myself. The silence cracked like thunder when the commanding officer stepped forward, face solemn. He lifted his chin, voice carrying across the field with sharp authority. "Company, present arms." In perfect unison, 200 soldiers snapped their hands to their brows. The air rang with the force of it, a tidal wave of sound and motion crashing over me. The sight seared into my soul, the rows of saluting soldiers, every face hard with respect, eyes on me. It was not just protocol, it was a declaration. I froze, throat tight, eyes blurring. My father's face drained of color. His mouth opened, then closed again, jaw working, but no words came. He had expected me to stumble, to break, to confirm his judgment. Instead, he was forced to watch as 200 voices of discipline, unity, and strength rose, not in words, but in a single, undeniable gesture, honoring me. Tears welled but did not fall. I returned the salute, hand steady, arm sharp. The sound of it echoed louder in my chest than in the air. The officer lowered his hand, and the command rippled back through the ranks. "Order! Arms!" The soldiers moved as one, rifles dropping with a resounding thud. The applause came next, waves of it crashing from the crowd. I lowered my hand slowly, my gaze locking with my father's once more. His pride had crumbled. Behind his eyes, I saw not control, but something hollow, fragile, breaking. For the first time, I didn't flinch. I didn't search for approval. I didn't bow. As the ceremony ended, I stepped off the stage. The applause followed me, heat shimmering on my skin, but I felt cool inside, still, clear. I walked past him deliberately. His head turned, his eyes burning into me, searching for some sign of submission, but I kept my gaze forward, shoulders straight, heart steady. For years, I had fought for his approval, but that day, with 200 soldiers saluting me, I realized I never needed it. I had already won. Looking back, I realized the greatest battles aren't always fought on the training ground. They're fought inside our own hearts. For years, I believed my worth depended on someone else's approval. But the truth is, strength comes from within, and dignity is something no one can take away unless we hand it over. My story is just one example, but maybe it reminds you that you don't have to wait for anyone to validate who you are. In America, we value independence, resilience, and the power of standing tall in the face of doubt. That's what I learned, and it's the message I hope stays with you. So I ask you, have you ever faced a moment where someone said you weren't enough but you proved them wrong? What did that feel like? Share it in the comments because your story might inspire someone else who needs to hear it today. If this video touched your heart, let me know by dropping a 1 in the comments or by telling me where you're watching from. And if it didn't speak to you, I'd still love to hear why. It helps us connect and grow together. Most of all, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next story. If this one gave you hope, imagine what's coming next. Let's keep walking this journey together.